Normally, the Chicago routine, Larry, would be this: I would announce the title of your last paper or something, and then we'd be on with it on the grounds that you're all we care about is the current idea. But of course, that's not true. So, not a long biography, but I think those of us who are here know that we're in for a treat. One of our great thinkers, lucky that he went to Washington to be Secretary of the Treasury and much else. Not yet teaching at a law school, but there's always opportunity for that. But I notice teaching with a law professor this spring, or it's right now maybe. So that's always a good sign, the migration towards field. But today, like so many of us, Professor Summers is moving outside his normal comfort zone to think about new topics, and he knows that you want to ask questions. And so without further ado, I give you Lawrence Summers.
Thank you very much. I know I admire this institution very much, and I think I am glad to be here. This is, for me, a kind of Admiral Stockdale moment. The older among you will remember that Admiral Stockdale was Ross Perot's running mate in 1992, and in the middle of the presidential debate, when rather buffaloed by what was going around, vice presidential debate, when rather buffaloed by what was going on around him, he said, "Why am I here?" And I am not a humanist. I am not a law professor. And I am married to an expert on literature. But I am certainly no expert on literature. So why am I here? I do wonder. There are two reasons. One is that I have a general commitment to the philosophy that from time to time one should push oneself out of one's comfort zone. And I am way out of my comfort zone here today. And the other is that Martha Nussbaum is both persistent and persuasive and even insistent. And if she thinks that I can meet her high standards, then perhaps I can, although I doubt it. I confess that when I discussed this venture with my wife, who was of some assistance to me in thinking about it, she did say to me when I explained that it was law and literature and humanists and all of that, she said, "Well, Larry, think about it this way. The worst thing that can happen is that a modest-sized group of humanists will think you're a fool. And frankly, that won't be that large a percentage increase in the number of humanists who, given your performance as president of Harvard, think you are a fool. And so you really have very little to fear." As I thought about it, I thought about the relationship between humanists, the economy, and economics. And I realized that there was a rather profound asymmetry. Humanists, as Vidra Malakowski is perhaps an exception, prominent exception to what I am about to say. But humanists, as we saw in the papers that are presented this morning and presented through the rest of this session, have taken a profound interest in the workings of the economy as it affects the human condition, the relationship between fortune and marriage, the psychological aspects of work, the ways in which economic forces shape culture, and much, much more. But when I tried to think about the relationship between economists and the humanities, it was rather thinner gruel. Keynes was an extraordinarily cultured man who took a deep and, as best I can tell from reading his biographies, thoughtful interest in all aspects of culture and the humanities. But it is, I think, fair to say that that was an avocation largely separate from his vocation as an economist. Philosophy has informed no small part of the tradition of what economists think of as welfare economics. Welfare economics is not the study of welfare programs. It's the study of how to think normatively about when economic policies do and do not make the world a better place, perhaps most notably in the work of Amartya Sen. Economists are intermittently drawn to the study of mainstream economists, are intermittently drawn to the study of economic history, both for its own sake, because it's thought to be important to understand the past, and because it's thought that history will inform thinking about the present and the future. I think it's fair to say that the financial crisis has occasioned a modest resurgence of interest in history because you have to get data from somewhere, and the only financial crises there are to study took place in the past, and unless you're prepared to go to the fairly distant past, you can't find very many financial crises. But all of what I'm saying is, I think it's fair to say, rather at the margins of what economists do. One would search the writings and utterances of Paul Samuelson or Milton Friedman, Alan Greenspan or Paul Volcker for a very long time without coming to almost any humanistic, cultural, or literary reference. It is true that there are a number of references to Jane Austen and to Balzac in Thomas Piketty's celebrated book, but I think it is fair to say that they function as a kind of intellectual ballast that lead people who want to believe that there's a deep social justice problem, who can't possibly follow any of the analytical work in Piketty, to think of him as a real intellectual because he refers a few times to Jane Austen, rather than anything that represents a serious contribution to Piketty's argument. So the tradition of economists learning from literature, it seemed to me, was very thin. I consulted with my wife as to how I might proceed within the context of my rather profound limitations. I should say this is another former Treasury Secretary whose linkages between, in any professional setting, between his work and literature had previously taken the form of explaining as president of Harvard to very anxious parents whose children wished to study the humanities or study English, that the then Treasury Secretary, Hank Paulson, had been an English major in college. And so they should not, and he had gone on to make $600 million at Goldman Sachs. And so they should not fear if their children wish to pursue a genuinely liberal education. And at the time, I actually had a rather impressive list of people like Paulson who had, whose genuinely liberal education had not stood in the way of their making the great fortunes that parents desired for their children. My wife, perhaps with a sense that my patience would not be infinite, suggested that I consider as a text Melville's Paradise of Bachelors, Tartarus of Maids. It was not a text that I had previously encountered. It is two juxtaposed short stories. And what I realized in reading those short stories, the first of which is, they're called short stories, but I would regard them less as short stories than as thick and evocative descriptions of situations by a narrator. The first describes the circumstances of a group of men, lawyers, convened in a London club to eat and even more to drink in splendiferous circumstances. And the second, only marginally linked by a common narrator and a very little bit of common action, describes a New England paper mill of a kind of American Gothic variety in the middle part of the 19th century. And what I did realize was that in his way, Melville commented on and evoked in terms that were then contemporary and in some respects seem now contemporary, but in other respects seem a little bit out of touch with contemporary debates, 5 themes that are fairly central in discussions of the economy and, at least in a broad way, economic policy. Melville's short story speaks to inequality, to globalization, to questions of gender, to issues around paper-pushing parasites and the economy, and to capital and its effect on the human experience. So what I want to briefly do this morning is reflect on what Melville seemed to be saying and evoking in those areas, and how at least one economist and economic policymaker would think about those questions today. In fact, inequality in the human condition, by any measure, when Melville wrote, was far smaller than it is today. Inequality within countries, on some measure, was greater, but inequality on a global basis was far smaller than it was today. And yet, Melville wrote about the dreamy paradise of bachelors found in the stony heart of stunning London. The thing called pain, the bugbear-styled trouble, these two legends seemed preposterous to their bachelor imaginations. But then he writes of the maids, 365 days, excepting Sundays, Thanksgiving, and fast days. That's our rule. And he speaks also of their white skin, sarcastically referred to as coming from the white paper of the mill, but really coming from the absence of the opportunity to be outdoors. And what he is, I think, seeking to convey is something that in some ways is more true and in some ways is less true today. The utter difference in circumstances, concern of people who have a common humanity. If one looks at the way the people in this room live and the way the average citizen of Africa or the average citizen of rural India live, the difference is far greater than it was in Melville's day. That's true, by the way, not just if you measure income, but if you measure life expectancy or other aspects of living standards. And yet, what I think of when I read of Melville and what is increasingly different today is a common awareness that is far greater. Those bachelors had essentially no awareness of that paper mill. Those in that paper mill had essentially no awareness of those bachelors. And today, in a world where there are already more cell phones than there are adults, and where there will be more smartphones than there are adults by 2020, this sense of stark difference comes with a much greater common awareness. Perhaps it was a function of Melville's novel to bring about that awareness, but that awareness is much starker today. Globalization. There are many, many themes and aspects with respect to globalization. The more traditional critique of globalization, it seems to me, involves in some way the notion of exploitation, the notion that the wealthy are exploiting the poor, that the colonizers are exploiting the colonized. And it is that notion that Melville conjures. At one point, he refers to the fact that it is not unlikely, then murmured I, that Annie, I can't read my writing, that these overdue rags, there may be some old shirts gathered from the dormitories of the paradise of bachelors. That there in that paper plant, there was a need for rags, and thoughtlessly, those rags might have come from the sumptuous garments of the paradise of bachelors. One can still hear in the Indian or Nigerian parliament echoes of Nehru complaining about how the North is exploiting the South. One can find such ideas expressed in the United Nations, and there surely are respects in which the North does exploit the South. Bill Clinton's list of his half dozen largest mistakes as president include the trade agreements that, in the name of protecting intellectual property, for a time made AIDS drugs prohibitively expensive in large parts of Africa. But the concern about globalization today, at least in the United States and Europe, the animating concern is actually of a rather different kind than the one that Melville touched on. And it is perhaps a less morally appealing kind, but it is an important kind nonetheless. It is that the rise of the poor is going to come at the expense of the rich. It is that they are taking over our country. Either they are coming into our country and we need to build a wall, see Donald Trump, or they are exporting to our country, and therefore we cannot be employed in as attractive a way as we used to be, see the substantial majority of the Democratic Party, or they are providing opportunities which are leading American companies to relocate outside the United States to the detriment of the United States, see almost everybody involved in the political system. And so where Melville, I think, was evoking something that was very connected to present debates with respect to the substantial inequality of experience, I think what he evokes with respect to globalization is something rather different than where our contemporary concern lies. The third thing, and if I were more erudite, I would be able to place this in a much better historical context. But the third thing that I at least was struck by in reading Melville was the salience of gender. I referred already to how it's the paradise of bachelors and it's the Tartarus of maids. The number 9, with respect to gestation of various kinds, appears a half dozen times in the Tartarus of maids. There is reference to flowing red rivers, and I could go on. So what struck me also was he says at one point, and so having no married women, what females we have are rightly enough called girls. And that follows on his observation that the narrator is told that having married women would be inconsistent with the serious work that is desired. And that, of course, goes hugely and centrally to what have been the concerns in this country and in every industrial country over the last 50 years and beyond with respect to the inclusion of women on similar and equal terms to men in the workforce. What, not surprisingly, is, I think, an important contemporary concern not presaged by Melville is the increasing sense in which the increasingly cognitive demands of the workplace and diminishing physical demands of the workplace are creating an environment to which, in many cases, women are better suited than men. 60% of the college graduates in the United States are women. 90% of the prison inmates in the United States are men. 2/3 of those who make high school honor rolls in the United States are women. The most serious group on most views in our population that is having great trouble coming to terms with the modern economy are men with limited education or cognitive skill. To take just one fact, in 1965, 1 out of 20 men in the United States between the ages of 25 and 54 was not working. Today, 3 out of 20 men between the ages of 25 and 54 is not working. And if one looks at those without a high school degree, 1 in 3 are not working. And of course, if 1 in 3 are not working at a point in time, well over a half will have been out of work for more than a year within the last 5 years. So on questions of gender, it seems to me that Melville gets it exactly right in presaging what were the central concerns of the 20th century, which is as much as he could surely aspire to. But I am not sure he gets right what it seems to me will be a set of central questions in the 21st century. An increasing theme in critiques of the way modern industrial economies or modern developed economies function is what is seen as the excessive role of finance. Sometimes it's framed in terms of the excessive role of lawyers as well. Sometimes it's framed in terms of the decline of manufacturing. In the United States today, only 1 in 20 workers is doing production work in manufacturing. One hears the number that 1 in 10 people are working in manufacturing, but that includes the CEO's assistant, that includes accountants, that includes people doing advertising. Actual producing in manufacturing is now as an activity in America where farming was in the 1940s. Is that a concern? How should one think? Should one think of derivatives traders as being at the cutting edge of a progressive new way of adding value? Or should one think of them as parasites striving to win a zero-sum game with those outside the guild being the losers? Melville implicitly, if not explicitly, answers that question in a way that is hostile. He doesn't talk about finance, but he does talk about lawyers. And there is a sense that, yes, these are people who live comfortably and who did something, but it's just good fortune for them. There's no sense at all that any kind of valuable service is being provided. Is he right? We'll all have our own judgments. I don't know whether it was Coase who said, I think not, I think it was Oliver Williamson, who said that lawyers were transactions costs engineers, whose function was to draft contracts, establish institutions in ways that minimized transactions and fixed costs. Every time I talk to undergraduates about financial markets, I begin by explaining that any society has a profound challenge, that there are people who desire to put aside savings for retirement or for a rainy day, and that there are other people who have opportunities to put capital to use in ways that will cause it to multiply over time. But they are very different people, and that something has to connect them, and that it is a very fundamental and valuable function to connect them, and that is the function of a financial system. To say that is not to defend every or even most efflorescences of that financial system, but it is to recognize that paper pushing can have very substantial and real indirect value. It is true that the guy standing at in the pit of the CME is basically trying to win a zero-sum game. It is also true that there are farmers who can plant their crops more securely in the knowledge that they will be able to sell those crops because that zero-sum game competitor is standing there. On balance, Melville poses the question. The tone is, I think, rather more negative than the tone that I would take, but that's perhaps a reflection of the fact that I'm an economist who's willing to come to the University of Chicago. A reader of the national mood would, I think, find views not at all dissimilar from those that Melville expressed. Finally, Melville anticipated a lot when he said, machinery, that vaunted slave of humanity, here stood menially served by human beings who served mutely and cringingly as the slave serves the sultan. This is not quite your standard economist's view of a production function in which capital and labor are combined to produce output. It anticipates in a very vivid way subsequent critiques of Taylorism, the discussions of the alienation associated with the assembly line, and raises the question that is today's question in the way that the human consequences of the assembly line was the question of the early 20th century, what the consequences of interaction and engagement with information technology is. I don't think anybody can speak with any confidence to what, over a 25-year period, the impact of information technology on the way in which people work will come. I would say, so far, the tendency has been to make work better, more fulfilling, more exciting, with greater leverage for those with the highest ability. The people in this room who are interested in learning things can learn far more, far faster because of what you can find with a Google search engine than would have been imaginable 30 years ago. And there are many other tasks that are simply being replaced and for which people are no longer engaged because of the presence of technology. It is, I suspect, less pleasant to do a phone answering job in today's world with the various kinds of assistance and monitoring that is involved with information technology than might have been the case 25 years ago. But in the whole, I suspect that the impact of information technology, rather different from the impact of the kind of machinery that Melville had in mind, is to supplement some jobs and to replace other jobs rather than to dehumanize jobs in which large numbers of people are functioning. So what did I get out of all of this? I think what I was reminded of was that we are all prisoners of our method and our model, and that the way in which I approach thinking about economic problems, and the way I will continue to largely think about economic problems, achieves substantial analytic clarity at the expense of very much textured understanding. And that what I learned from thinking about the paradise of bachelors and the Tartarus of maids was that there was a great deal that one would be led to think about by encountering that degree of texture, and that perhaps if we in economics were more reciprocal in our approach to the humanities, we would be a bit more humble in our judgments, wide in our conception, and wise in our policy advice. Thank you very much. I would be happy to respond to anybody's questions or comments on any aspect of all of this. Yes, sir.
President Summers, thank you for your wonderful remarks. One of the phenomena that is in the public debate about economic policy and society today is obviously inequality. And if I remember correctly, a major trend in inequality has been kind of the growing divide between the very top, whether it's the 1% or 0.1% or whatever, and the middle, rather than the duration at the bottom, at least in the U.S. domestic context. And one explanation that's conventionally advanced for that is sort of increasing returns to talent or to skill, like the top basketball players or top in any field, people command greater returns. And I was wondering to what extent you find that compelling, because on the other hand, one could think of CEOs like take one and appoint another COO for half the salary. I'm sure they would probably do an equally good job. So what's kind of behind that phenomenon? Thank you.
So there are two striking aspects of American inequality. One is that the gap between the wage of a college graduate and the wage of a non-college graduate has tripled since 1980. And the other, which is the one you emphasize, is that the share of income going to the top 1% has risen by a factor of about 2.5. Just to make your point with a little drama, if we had the same income distribution in the United States, if we had the same total income as we have today, and we had the income distribution that we had in 1979, the top 1% of the population would have $1 trillion less, or $750,000 less per family. Percentiles 80 to 99 would be unchanged, and percentiles 1 to 80 would have $1 trillion more, which would be about $10,000 more per person, which for the average family in that group would be about a $10,000 increase in income. So you're absolutely right that it's. I was in a discussion last night at the business school with Kevin Murphy, who wanted to put total emphasis on the first fact about the college graduates and education and all of that, and I was emphasizing your fact about the top 1%. But in fact, they're both highly salient. Why is it? Surely it has something to do with, and this is what you were saying, a University of Chicago idea, the late Sherwin Rosen's idea of superstars. And essentially Rosen's idea was that before there were any recordings, it was almost as good to be the 5th best cellist in the United States as it was to be the best cellist in the United States, because there was a big demand for cello concerts, and people had to hire people to give cello concerts, and you'd rather get the best person than have the 5th best person, but the 5th best person was really pretty good. But in a world of air travel and recordings, you can get the first best person almost everywhere, and no one has a need to settle for the second best person. And so the rewards flow disproportionately to the top. I'm not sure you're right about the CEO labor market. There are professors of finance who study, this is a rather grisly kind of study, but it has been done a number of times by professors of finance. I think a reading of the financial literature would support the judgment that if Jamie Dimon had a heart attack tomorrow, JP Morgan would lose $5 billion of value. If you should regard that as a reasonably well-established social science fact. Jamie Dimon is paid in a good year $20 million. And so who's being exploited? I have the same feelings about social justice. The way in which you suggested that I actually think that an important part, I'm going to say something now that everything I said so far is what any well-informed economist would tell you. What I'm going to say now is sort of my opinion about something, but not, there'd be thoughtful people who would not agree with me. I think that part of what is broadly happening that explains the increase in inequality is that I think, normally speaking, in the labor market, we see substantial compression of pay relative to productivity, and that what we are now seeing is, what we are now seeing is that a variety of forces are driving pay closer to productivity. I see the law school's dean sitting in back. I'm not going to ask him to confirm or deny the following propositions, which I'll bet are true. I'll bet his two best paid senior tenured faculty are paid more than his three lowest paid tenured faculty. And I'll bet he would substantially prefer to lose his three lowest paid senior faculty than to lose his two highest paid faculty. And what that is saying is that pay has not diverged, pay is not fully adjusted to productivity. And I think that you're seeing a variety of forces that are driving it. So I think it's a mistake. Look, here's another way to say it. You think CEO pay is way too high because, or something. A lot of people think CEO pay is way too high because they're getting it. They're exploiting the shareholders, and the shareholders aren't paying attention. But just to ask you in the abstract, what should the ratio be of the CEO of a company that employs 80,000 people to the 40th best partner at McKinsey, a firm that consults? You'd probably say that the CEO has much more responsibility. What seems fair to you for that ratio? Yeah, the number's about the actual number is about 4. Now you can say that it's all sort of a rip-off, and the consultants are going to rip off everything. and like I relate, but it's believe me, I relate. But it very much goes to the question of whether it's some agency problem where the CEOs are taking it from the shareholders, or whether it's some broader, deeper phenomenon. And the reason why, and we're getting pretty fairly afield from Melville, but the reason why I would tend to be supportive of progressive taxation and of increasingly progressive taxation is that I think in a variety of ways pay is being driven to productivity. Productivity is kind of unequal. Over the long term, we can do a lot of things to work on human capital. But for the next 20 years, we sort of have the labor force and human capital distribution we have. And there probably is going to be substantial inequality, and the least we can do is tax people more effectively on ability to pay. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Summers. Given your effort in the rescue of big banks in the aftermath of the financial crisis, and I believe you represent certain cautious pragmatism in this effort.
Represented what?
Cautious pragmatism.
I'll take that.
What do you think of the rhetoric?
I've been called worse.
So what do you think of the rhetoric or value exemplified by Bernie Sanders, that the political establishment and Wall Street together caused the financial turmoil, and the tax on financial speculation should be imposed, and the money be used for egalitarian purpose? What sort of money in law and money literature is it?
Look, I think complex societies have a deep problem, which is that there are certain fields which you don't learn about if you don't sort of believe in them. So let's take an area away from finance. The regulation of nuclear power. Well, you probably think that the people who regulate nuclear power should be kind of well-trained and experienced in nuclear engineering. But why would you go into nuclear engineering if you didn't kind of believe in nuclear power? If you didn't have a kind of bias that nuclear power was okay, what would you do? You go to graduate school in nuclear engineering? Then what do you do? You work for a nuclear. What do you do with your nuclear engineering degree? You work with a nuclear power plant company. You could be an academic, but if you were an academic who was going to be a good academic in nuclear engineering, you'd probably have some connections with industry and all of that. So there is a problem with questions like derivatives, which is that you sort of want policy made by experts, but the process of becoming an expert is likely to cause you to be a bit cognitively captured. And it's a deep problem that is not unique to finance. It is certainly true that because of the role of money in our political system, there are biases that creep in. I used to remark during the debates on Dodd-Frank that there were 5 lobbyists for every member of the House or Senate who were working the issue. And there weren't very many lobbyists who were working on the other side. So, is there a problem? Is there a problem? Yes. Are there further restrictions and regulations that I would favor that don't happen in part because of the power of money interests? Yes. Is there a way of having a 100% safe financial system? No. I go back and forth on the merits of Senator Sanders' transactions tax. What makes me a cautious pragmatist is that I think hard about questions like, if you put the tax on and all the trading goes to London, you won't raise much revenue, you'll lose your regulatory nexus with the trading, and why exactly will you be better off? If you put that tax on, who is actually going to pay that tax? Is Goldman Sachs going to pay that tax, or is Goldman Sachs going to charge a slightly higher commission that covers that tax, and then it's going to be paid by the Nebraska pension fund? Do we think that markets with less liquidity are better markets? If you look at the history of financial crises, 80% of the financial distress in the history of the world is associated with banks lending too much money against real estate. And then the real estate collapsing in value. There's no derivatives. There's no high frequency anything. There is a kind of speculation, but not the kind of speculation people have in mind when they talk about people with their crazy computers. So you could argue it both ways, but it seems to me what you have to do is try to trace in a very careful and analytical ways what the consequences are. And I think there is a problem, which is that the people who are likely to be best at doing that are likely to have some bias towards believing in the activity. And I think that's a general problem in regulating complex activities in our society, and finance is a prominent example. Yeah.
Do you sense that there was anything particular in the analytical humanist world where you would greatly pick the whole world in a kind of unified literary, which I know at the time there was a lot more kind of lower income literacy and reading maybe than there is today. though you can go to Harvard and study literature and then join a hedge fund and become a billionaire, has something been lost irretrievably now of this kind of early humanistic vision that will never get back because STEM is going to pull the entire world along with the power of money.
I was thinking to myself, am I hoping that people are going to ask me questions about Melville? That'll mean they respected the talk. Or am I hoping they're going to ask me questions about something which I can give intelligent answers to? And I wasn't sure which I preferred. I'm not sure. I'm not.
The answer is no.
I'm not. Well, I'll let you address that more fully. I'm not sure that your premise that there was kind of the premise of your question seemed like that there was kind of more pervasive and common cultural experience then, because everybody read Dickens, than there sort of is today. That's kind of seemed like a premise of your question. My suspicion is that you'd actually learn that there were a ton of illiterate people in London in 1840, and that you'd learn that more or less everybody could watch House of Cards today. And so, my suspicion is that in terms of common cultural touch points, if that's what you were asking about, I would be quite surprised if a serious empirical study of the question, which I've never done, or even serious reflection, which I have not, I've reflected on this question only since you asked me, wouldn't support the judgment that there was much more, that there was more commonality and cohesion in the experience today than there would have been at that time. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think I may be one of the few in the room who is professionally credentialed in the study of American literature. And I think you can go home and you can say that you didn't hurt yourself. That in fact you helped yourself with this problem. I guess I wanted to ask you if you felt that you learned something about the modern economy by reading this Melville story, and not just the difference between the way in which, say, Melville saw the economy and the way you saw the economy. And I ask because I think the text is a really tricky one. And Melville wants to stop short, so he'll tell you the rags that are coming into the paper factory may have been in the bachelor's, they may have been the bachelor's underwear or something like that. But he won't tell you, and before that they might have been, cotton picked by slaves. And he won't hit you over the head and say, paper is an information technology, and you're reading this, you're fingering this paper, and the paper is the thing that is degrading the lives of these women that you're reading about, right? So there's a kind of subtlety to it, and I'm just kind of curious if that kind of subtlety wears off on you.
So my wife and I, my wife's Lisa New, and I talk about this kind of thing, and it's, I think it's probably fair to say that as a general matter, the way in which I prefer communications have a kind of clarity and directness, which she finds to be unsubtle, overbearing, and ineffective, and without nuance. The way in which she prefers communication is ways in which I find to be confusing yip yap, and why can't they just say what they mean? And so it's not so easy to agree on what movies we're going to go see on Saturday night. Given this, I'm not sure that I can honestly say that I was so much educated about the modern economy as I was guided to reflect on aspects of the modern economy that I might never have been led to reflect, to reflect on. When I think about capital and labor, my first thought is of a mathematical equation that says that output is a mathematical function of how much capital there is and how much labor there is. And my second set of thoughts go to how you add up machines and buildings to make the concept of capital. And my third set of thoughts go to the fact that there may be uncertainty in how much capital it takes to create a kind of labor. Whereas, how much capital, how much uncertainty in how much output will come from a given amount of capital and labor. And I go a long time, like maybe forever, without thinking about how the capital makes the labor feel. If I hadn't had the experience of reading Melville, and so that's why I found it to be a stimulating and useful experience. Would I probably have liked it better if there had been a little more of what you call hitting my head over the conclusion? Yeah, I probably would have liked it better, but that's why I'm in the line of work I'm in rather than a different line of work. Let me take one more question.
Okay, half question.
All right. Yeah.
So how should we feel about the market for Melvilles? So the market for really high quality fiction, right? You can tell a story where the superstar model that you mentioned before increases the return to being a Melville. You can tell a story where Hank Paulson might have been the next great Melville, but his returns from being the CEO of Goldman Sachs were much higher. So we lost out on a Melville because of changes in the economy. And I'm sure there are many more stories you can tell, but is there anything you would predict about what the future output of great fiction would be?
Look, my first view, I don't really answer that. There are people who study the economics of the arts and the economics of publishing, and it's not my field. But so I'll just tell you how I think about the question. So my first set of thoughts would be the fact that all the middlemen are coming out must, on net, be good for the activity of fiction writing. That is, the fact that you can write your fiction, you can post your fiction on the internet, and then somebody can download it, and there's much less typesetting, proofreading, warehousing, distributing, all of that, has to, on net, be good for the consumers and good for the content producers. And so it's a better time to be a creative than most previous times. That'll be the first view I would have, and I think that's probably where I'd ultimately come down. I do know that it's better to be Stephen King and harder to be a good mid-list author in terms of the advances you receive, or at least that's what people say, than used to be the case. And that operates a bit in the opposite direction. But I can't really believe at the end of the day that despite, it's a different subject than our subject today, despite the substantial amount of wailing by academic humanists about the destruction of the culture and the tyranny of STEM and all of that if you take a full and inclusive view, it isn't a better time where there's more appreciation for literature and more, and therefore more demand to create good literature than has been the case historically. I just look at my wife's probably taught more students in her MOOC last year, even allowing for the fact that not all students who sign up for a MOOC really watch it all, even making proper allowance for that. My wife probably taught more students with her MOOC last year than she taught in her entire career. And that kind of thing, it seems to me, is happening many times over. But since you asked, I answered, but I don't regard myself as an authority. Thank you for having me.